The night was filled with lights and music, and the sound of laughter echoed across the grand hall. Expensive chandeliers sparkled above the long tables decorated with silver cutlery, golden plates, and dishes that smelled richer than anything a poor soul could ever dream of. Guests in shining clothes and sparkling jewelry moved about, speaking loudly, praising the food, and admiring the billionaire who had arranged the feast. The air carried the smell of roasted meat, baked bread, and rare spices. For the rich, it was normal. For the boy standing at the corner, it was a world he had never imagined entering. The boy's clothes were torn, his face covered with dust, and his bare feet showed the roughness of streets he walked every day. He had been wandering outside, stomach growling, searching for a piece of thrown bread or a kind hand that would give him leftovers. When he saw the open doors of the mansion, curiosity and hunger pulled him closer. At first he stood by the gate, staring at the lights as if it were another world. But then, step by step, he slipped inside, unnoticed by the guards, distracted by the grand arrivals of the rich. Inside, his eyes widened. He had never seen so much food in his life. Dozens of servants carried trays filled with steaming dishes, pouring expensive drinks into crystal glasses, while guests laughed without care. For them, wasting food was nothing. For him, even a crumb was treasure. He stood frozen, watching as if it were a dream, afraid someone would push him out at any moment. His heart raced between fear and hunger, but his eyes could not leave the scene. The billionaire sat at the head of the table, wearing a black suit that shone under the lights. His face was calm, confident, and proud. Around him sat people of influence, business partners, politicians, celebrities, all speaking to impress him, all laughing too loudly to hide their greed for his attention. The boy's gaze locked on the billionaire's plate. Among the many dishes, one seemed to carry a strange look, something the boy recognized from the streets. His sharp eyes, trained by survival, noticed it instantly. He remembered the smell from the garbage bins where he sometimes searched for food. It was spoiled, dangerous, the kind that could sicken even a strong man. The boy's stomach had suffered enough from such mistakes to never forget it again. But here it was, dressed in fine garnish, presented on a golden tray as if it were the meal of kings. His heart started to beat harder. He wanted to speak, but fear tightened his throat. Who would listen to him? A destitute boy in rags had no place in this hall of wealth. Yet as the billionaire lifted his fork, slowly cutting a piece of the dish, the boy felt panic strike. His legs shook, but his voice broke free. He shouted louder than he had ever dared before, "Don't eat that!" The words echoed through the hall like a clap of thunder. Music stopped, laughter froze, and every head turned toward the corner where he stood. Guests gasped, their eyes filled with shock and annoyance. Some whispered insults, others laughed cruelly. The billionaire himself stopped, his fork still in the air, and stared with disbelief at the thin, trembling boy who had dared to break the silence of his world. The boy's chest rose and fell quickly, his heart pounding. He had done the unthinkable. He had interrupted the most powerful man in the room. The weight of dozens of eyes fell upon him like heavy stones. He expected to be dragged out, beaten, or mocked. But he could not take back his words. Hunger had brought him into the hall, but instinct and memory had given him courage. He stood there, shaking but firm, his dirty hands clenched at his sides, his wide eyes fixed only on the billionaire's plate. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of candles burning above. In that pause, a strange energy filled the hall. The boy, with nothing but his ragged clothes and desperate voice, had become the center of everything. The guests waited for the billionaire's reaction. Would he laugh? Would he grow angry? Would he punish the boy for daring to speak? For the boy, this moment felt endless. He didn't know if his words had saved a life or destroyed his own. But one thing was certain, he had spoken the truth and nothing could erase it. The hall was frozen in silence. Forks and knives lay untouched, half raised in the air. The music that had been playing softly in the background had stopped, as if even the instruments were waiting to hear what came next. All eyes were locked on the boy standing near the corner of the hall. His chest rose and fell quickly, his thin frame trembling, but his eyes remained fixed on the billionaire at the head of the table. The three words he had shouted, "Don't eat that," still hung heavy in the air, echoing louder than the laughter that had filled the room only seconds ago. The guests were the first to break the silence, their whispers swirling like restless wind. "Who is this boy?" one woman muttered, lifting her jeweled hand to her mouth. "How dare he interrupt?" Another man scoffed, his face red with insult. Some laughed cruelly. shaking their heads at the sight of a ragged child interrupting the richest man in the city. But beneath the ridicule there was something else in the air. Unease. The billionaire himself did not move right away. His fork hovered just above the plate, a piece of food cut and ready to be eaten. His sharp eyes narrowed first at the boy, then at the dish in front of him. 1,000 questions raced through his mind. Who was this child? How had he entered his mansion? And why, of all things, would he shout such a command with such desperation? The boy's knees threatened to give way, but his will kept him standing. He could feel the heat of judgment burning into his skin, yet he didn't look away. His voice trembled, but it carried the urgency of truth. Don't eat it. Please, he whispered this time, softer but clear enough for the whole table to hear. His eyes darted back to the plate, then returned to the billionaire's face. The billionaire set his fork down slowly. A murmur passed through the guests as they watched him lean back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the child as though trying to read his soul. And why, he said at last, his voice deep and controlled, should I not eat this? The question cut through the whispers, silencing the crowd again. The boy swallowed hard. He could feel the dryness in his throat, the fear gripping him like chains. But behind the fear was the memory of the streets, the rotten food, the sickness, the times he had doubled over in pain from eating what looked safe but was poisoned with rot. He remembered the smell that had taught him to survive, the sharpness in the air that others never noticed. That same smell lingered now, faint but real, coming from the dish before the billionaire. He pointed with a shaking finger, his voice louder now, desperate. Because it's bad. It's not right. I know that smell, I've been sick from it before. You can't eat it. A gasp spread across the hall. The guests turned to each other in disbelief. Some laughed again, dismissing him as a mad street child. He's lying, a man muttered. He just wants attention. Another hissed. Throw him out before he ruins the evening. The servants shifted nervously, unsure of what to do, but the billionaire did not order him removed. He continued to study the boy, his sharp mind weighing the situation. There was no tremor of dishonesty in the child's voice. It wasn't the arrogance of a troublemaker. It was the raw desperation of someone who had known hunger and pain too well. For reasons he could not explain, the billionaire's hand felt heavy when he thought of lifting his fork again. Check the dish, he ordered suddenly, his voice commanding. The head chef froze, shocked by the demand. Sir, the meal is prepared by the best, he began, but the billionaire's cold glare cut him off. Check it, he repeated. The staff scrambled, lifting the tray and hurrying toward the kitchen. The hall buzzed again with whispers, speculation running wild. Some accused the boy of causing unnecessary drama. Others wondered if the child might be telling the truth. And through it all, the boy stood still, breathing heavily, his eyes never leaving the billionaire's face. The billionaire leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, and looked at the boy with a strange curiosity. You risked everything, he said quietly enough that only those near him could hear, to stop me from taking one bite. Why? The boy's eyes glistened. He didn't speak of himself, didn't mention his hunger, his pain, or his loneliness. He simply said, because no one should suffer like that. Not even you. The words carried more weight than anyone expected. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes. For the first time that night, the billionaire felt something rare stir inside him. Uncertainty. Moments later, the chef returned, pale and shaken. He whispered into the ear of the billionaire, but the room was so silent that everyone could hear. Sir, the child is right. The food was spoiled. It could have been dangerous, gasps erupted. The guest recoiled, horrified by how close the evening had come to disaster. The billionaire froze in his chair, staring at the boy as if seeing him for the first time. The hall that had once looked down on the child now sat in awe. The destitute boy with nothing but his voice had changed the entire night with 3 desperate words. The room, though saved from disaster, did not react with kindness at first. The billionaire sat frozen in his chair, his mind replaying the chef's words again and again. The child is right. The food was spoiled. Around him, his guests were not relieved, they were furious. Murmurs turned into sharp whispers into angry voices. How dare this filthy boy ruin such a grand evening? One woman hissed, clutching her pearl necklace as if she had been personally insulted. A heavy-set man slammed his hand against the table. This is an outrage. He should be dragged out immediately. Another guest sneered. He probably planned this just to make himself look important. The boy stood still, his hands shaking at his sides. He had expected anger, but the sharpness of their words cut deeper than he imagined. Instead of thanking him for saving the billionaire, they looked at him like a pest, a disease, something that had no right to breathe the same air as them. His stomach twisted, not just from hunger but from the weight of humiliation. The servants glanced nervously between the boy and their master, unsure what to do. The head of security stepped forward, ready to remove the child, but the billionaire raised his hand. That single gesture silenced the room more than shouting could have. The boy flinched, waiting for judgment, while the guests leaned in, eager to see punishment delivered. The billionaire's voice was calm, but cold enough to chill the air. "Do you all realize," he said slowly, "that if not for this boy, I might be lying on this floor fighting for my life?" His words landed heavily, silencing the muttering. "And yet you laugh, you mock. You call for him to be thrown out." His gaze moved across the table, sharp and unblinking. "Do you mock him because he is wrong or because he is poor?" The question stung like a slap. No one dared to answer. A few shifted in their chairs, avoiding his eyes. The boy blinked, confused. He had expected punishment, not defense. Still, anger had not vanished from the room. Prideful voices tried again. "Sir, even if he was right, his behavior was unacceptable. He has no place here." One man argued, his face flushed with embarrassment at being shown wrong. Another added, "This is your home, your event. Allowing such an interruption makes us all look foolish." The billionaire turned his gaze back to the boy. The boy's thin frame trembled, but his eyes were steady, filled with the same desperation that had saved a life minutes ago. He had no plan, no scheme, only truth. That truth made the billionaire hesitate, caught between two emotions he rarely experienced: gratitude and pride. Gratitude because the boy had saved him. Pride because being corrected by a child from the streets no less burned his ego. The hall's silence was not peace. It was tension, thick and heavy. The guests waited, leaning forward like an audience at a play, desperate to see whether the boy would be rewarded or crushed. The boy himself swallowed hard, unsure if he had made the greatest mistake of his life by speaking up. Finally, the billionaire spoke again, his voice low but powerful. "Tell me your name," he said to the boy. The question shocked everyone. A guest scoffed, "Why waste your time with this nobody?" Another muttered under his breath, "This is humiliating." The boy lowered his eyes. I don't have one that matters," he whispered. His parents had died years ago. The streets had stripped him of identity, reducing him to just another nameless figure in rags. The billionaire studied him carefully. Something in his answer tugged at him in a way money never had. The anger in the room began to shift, replaced by curiosity. Who was this boy who risked mockery and punishment to speak out? Who was he to silence a hall full of powerful people with just 3 words? For the first time in years, the billionaire felt his pride weaken. He realized that while his guests were furious at being inconvenienced, the boy had risked everything for nothing in return. And that truth was louder than any insult in the hall. The guests still wanted him gone. Their anger still burned. But the billionaire's face showed something different now. Not rage, but conflict. He was no longer just a powerful man about to eat a meal. He was a man staring at a reflection he did not expect to see. One that came not from wealth, but from a boy who had nothing. The guests were still restless, shifting in their chairs, their whispers filling the grand hall like buzzing bees. The boy stood rooted to the spot, torn between fear and determination. He knew if he stayed silent now, they would throw him out, and all he had done would be for nothing. His throat felt dry, but he forced himself to speak, his voice cracking at first but slowly gaining strength. "I saw it," he said, his eyes darting toward the kitchen. "Before they brought the food out, I was hiding near the back door. I smelled it. I know that smell. It's spoiled. It makes you sick. I've eaten food like that before. I've been on the ground, holding my stomach, begging it to stop. I've seen others. People who didn't survive it." The guests gasped. Some shook their heads, unwilling to believe a ragged street boy could have noticed something their chefs and servants missed. A woman muttered sharply, "Lies, he's desperate for attention." Another man hissed, "Ridiculous. He's trying to frighten us," but the boy pressed on. His voice trembled, but his words painted sharp pictures. "When you live on the streets, you learn. You can't waste anything. You smell food before you eat it. You check it with your eyes, with your hands, even when your stomach screams for it." I know the difference between food that fills you and food that kills you." His words struck something raw. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably. They had never imagined life like his. For them, food was endless, waste was normal. For him, survival depended on noticing the smallest details others overlooked. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on the boy. He didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. The boy's honesty felt heavier than the weight of the chandelier above them. The staff, standing at the edge of the hall, looked uneasy. One of the younger waiters exchanged glances with the chef. Finally, one of the servants spoke softly. "Sir, there was a dish in the kitchen earlier that we questioned. The smell was odd, but we thought it was masked by the spices." His voice trailed off, fear rising in his throat. A ripple of shock moved through the guests. Their mocking expressions faded. Suddenly, the boy's words didn't sound like madness. They sounded like truth. The billionaire's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair. He turned to the boy and asked, "Why didn't you run? Why didn't you leave after you saw it? Why take the risk of shouting here, knowing what they would do to you?" The boy swallowed hard. His stomach ached with hunger, but his heart was louder. "Because I couldn't let it happen. I know what it feels like to hurt from food like that. And if I let you eat it, I'd be no better than the ones who put it there." The billionaire's eyes narrowed. His mind, trained to suspect everyone, turned the words over. Was the boy protecting him or exposing something more sinister? His guest wanted to dismiss it as coincidence, but the truth gnawed at him. If the boy had not shouted, the consequences could have been deadly. The silence grew heavier. Every face in the room turned toward the billionaire, waiting for his judgment. Some guests still wanted the boy punished, others simply wanted the evening to continue. But the boy's trembling figure refused to fade from their minds. He stood like a shadow of truth they could not ignore. At last, the billionaire stood. His voice cut through the thick air. "Bring me the rest of the dishes. Every single one. I want them checked in front of everyone." Gasps followed. The order was unusual, but no one dared to question it. Servants hurried to obey, their hands shaking as they carried tray after tray into the center of the hall. The boy's eyes widened. He hadn't expected the billionaire to listen. The chef, pale and sweating, inspected each dish nervously. And then, with trembling hands, he lifted the cover of one more plate. The smell rose instantly, sharp and sour, impossible to deny. The guests recoiled, covering their noses, their disbelief shattering into horror. The boy lowered his gaze. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He only whispered, "I told you." The billionaire's hand froze midair. His face turned cold as stone. He realized then that this was no simple accident. Someone had either been careless or worse, deliberate. And the only reason he was still standing was because a nameless boy from the streets had spoken up. The hidden truth was out, and the room would never be the same again. The stench from the uncovered dish spread quickly, thick and undeniable. Guests pulled back from the table, some covering their mouths with napkins, others glaring at the staff in shock and disgust. The glittering room that only moments ago buzzed with laughter now carried an air of suspicion and unease. The billionaire stood slowly, his tall frame casting a shadow across the table. His eyes, sharp and unforgiving, moved from the spoiled dish to the staff lined up nervously along the wall. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice low but edged with steel. The chef, a man who had served him faithfully for years, stepped forward, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. His hands shook as he spoke. "Sir, I don't know how this happened. The ingredients were delivered fresh this morning. My team followed every instruction. Perhaps one of the shipments was faulty." His words stumbled out, weak and unconvincing. The billionaire's gaze hardened. "Faulty?" His voice rose, filling the hall. "You served me spoiled food, and in front of my guests you dare to call it faulty?" His hand struck the edge of the table, sending a glass tumbling and shattering on the floor. Guests jumped at the sound, and the staff flinched like frightened birds. The boy, standing near the corner, hugged his arms tightly around himself. His body trembled, but his eyes didn't leave the scene. He had seen the truth. He knew it wasn't just a careless mistake. There had been intent, or at least a dangerous negligence no one could excuse. The billionaire turned to the head of security. "Find out who handled this dish," he ordered. The guard nodded quickly, signaling his men to move toward the kitchen. The staff looked at one another, their faces pale, some trembling as if they carried secrets they couldn't keep hidden for long. The chef tried again, his voice desperate. "Sir, you know I would never harm you." "My loyalty." The billionaire cut him off with a glare so sharp it silenced the man instantly. "Loyalty means nothing if I am poisoned in my own house," he said coldly. His words stabbed deeper than any blade. The boy swallowed hard, his small voice rising suddenly. "It wasn't all of them," he said, his tone timid but clear. The guests turned, surprised he dared to speak again. His eyes darted toward the servants. "I saw one man near the kitchen door earlier. He carried the tray, but he wasn't cooking. He didn't belong there." Gasps spread across the room. The billionaire's head snapped toward the boy, eyes narrowing. "You saw this?" The boy nodded, his fear clear but his voice steady. "Yes, he left quickly after. I thought maybe I imagined it. But now I know." The billionaire's jaw tightened. He motioned for his security to act faster. Guards rushed into the kitchen, voices shouting as they demanded answers. Within minutes, a commotion broke out. A man in servant's clothing tried to slip out through the back, but he was caught, dragged into the hall, struggling and cursing. The guests gasped as the intruder was thrown to the floor. His disguise was clumsy. He didn't carry himself like a servant. The billionaire's face darkened with fury. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The man said nothing, his lips pressed shut, his eyes filled with defiance. The boy stepped back, fear running down his spine. He had uncovered something larger than spoiled food. This wasn't just negligence, it was an attempt at harm. An attack aimed directly at the most powerful man in the city. The billionaire towered over the captured man. His fists clenched, his anger barely contained. "You would have ended me tonight," he said, his voice rumbling like thunder. "If not for him." He turned his gaze sharply toward the boy. The hall followed his eyes, realizing the truth. The poorest person in the room had saved the richest from disaster. The guests sat stunned, their faces pale. The boy, trembling, couldn't believe what he had set into motion. He had only shouted 3 words, yet those words had ripped away the mask of a plot that could have destroyed a life of power and wealth. The billionaire's anger, though fierce, was now mixed with something else. Gratitude, though he struggled to show it. The confrontation with the staff had revealed more than spoiled food. It had revealed betrayal, and without the boy he might never have seen it until it was too late. The hall no longer mocked the child. They stared at him with something closer to awe, though their pride kept them silent. For the first time that night, the boy's voice had not only stopped a meal, it had exposed the truth. The man in servant's clothes was dragged away, his shouts echoing faintly as the guards hauled him toward the far end of the mansion. The grand hall, once glittering with pride and laughter, now sat in stunned silence. The spoiled dish still lay on the table, its foul smell a reminder of how close disaster had come. Every guest shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their jeweled hands trembling as they reached for their glasses, their eyes darting nervously between the billionaire and the boy who had just saved him. The billionaire remained standing, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the intruder had been. His mind churned like a storm. For years he had trusted his staff, believed his wealth could shield him from the dangers ordinary people faced. Yet here he was, moments from death, rescued not by guards or advisors, but by a ragged boy who had slipped in unnoticed. His pride, built over decades of power, felt suddenly fragile. He turned slowly, his gaze landing on the boy. The child shrank under the weight of those piercing eyes, but did not look away. The billionaire's voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but carried more force than any shout. "If not for you," he said, "I would have been finished tonight." A ripple moved through the room. Guests who had mocked the boy now lowered their heads, ashamed. The same mouths that had demanded he be thrown out moments earlier could not find the courage to speak. The truth was undeniable. They owed their host's survival to a boy they wouldn't have allowed to wash their shoes. The boy's lips parted, but no words came. His throat burned, his chest tight with fear and confusion. He had never been addressed with such seriousness by anyone, let alone the most powerful man in the city. He wanted to say he had only done what felt right, but his voice caught, too heavy with the weight of the moment. The billionaire's fists loosened and his shoulders sank slightly. He looked down at the plate once more, then back to the boy, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, his thoughts wrestled with themselves. Gratitude battled with pride. For a man who believed wealth could buy protection, it was humiliating to admit that protection had come from a child with nothing. Yet the gratitude pressed harder. undeniable and sharp. The guests began to whisper again, but this time their voices carried guilt instead of ridicule. He was brave, someone admitted softly. He could have stayed silent. Another added, he risked everything. We would have ignored him. For the first time, their eyes looked at the boy not with disdain, but with a flicker of respect, an uneasy acknowledgement that the lowest among them had done what none of them had. The billionaire lifted a hand, silencing the hall. All of you saw what happened tonight, he said, his voice calm but edged with command. Remember it. Remember who saved us. It was not wealth. It was not power. It was the eyes of someone who has lived closer to truth than any of us. The word struck like lightning. The boy's knees wobbled. No one had ever spoken of him that way. To be acknowledged, to be seen, it was almost harder to bear than the insults. The billionaire stepped closer. His shoes gleamed against the polished floor, while the boy's bare feet were cracked and dirty. The contrast was stark, yet in that moment the boy seemed taller than the jeweled guests who cowered behind their pride. The billionaire's eyes softened, just slightly. What is your name? He asked again. The boy hesitated, whispering, I don't know if it matters. His voice cracked, raw with years of being overlooked. It matters now, the billionaire said firmly, his tone carrying the weight of finality. The boy looked down, shame and uncertainty clashing inside him. For the first time in his life, he was being asked to stand, not as a shadow, not as a beggar, but as someone whose actions had changed the course of an entire evening. He didn't feel worthy, but the truth was clear. The weight of realization was no longer his alone. It pressed down on every person in that room. The guests sat in silence, forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their jewels, their power, their laughter, all had failed them. It was a voice they nearly ignored that saved their host. And in that silence, they began to understand what the billionaire already felt. Tonight was no longer just about a dinner. Tonight was about a lesson that would haunt them forever. The billionaire turned to his guests, his voice calm but cold. You came here to honor me, he said. But tonight the honor belongs to him. The boy's eyes widened, his heart pounding in disbelief. He had never been honored in his life. Hunger, loneliness, and humiliation had been his companions. And now, in a hall where he had no place, he was suddenly the center. For the first time in his life, the boy felt not invisible, but seen. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire felt not powerful but humbled. The weight of realization had settled on everyone. Nothing in that hall would ever feel the same again. The hall remained heavy with silence even after the guards had dragged the intruder away. Candles flickered, their flames swaying like nervous breaths, and the smell of spoiled food still clung faintly to the air. The billionaire stood tall at the head of the table, but his eyes were no longer on his guests nor on the shattered remains of his ruined feast. They were fixed on the boy, thin, ragged, barefoot, standing in the corner as if he did not belong, yet holding the weight of the evening on his narrow shoulders. The guests expected the night to end soon. They whispered among themselves, speculating whether the boy would finally be thrown out or quietly rewarded and dismissed. But instead of calling for his staff, the billionaire did something none of them expected. He took a slow step forward, toward the child. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floor, each step a reminder of the immense gap between their worlds. The boy flinched but did not run. His body trembled with exhaustion, his stomach still empty, but his eyes remained locked on the man he had saved. For the first time in his life, someone of great power was approaching him, not with cruelty, not with mockery, but with a gaze that seemed to search for something hidden deep inside him. When the billionaire stopped a few feet away, he lowered his voice. You've risked everything tonight, but I don't understand why. You could have stayed silent. No one would have noticed you. Why speak at all? The boy hesitated. His throat burned and his hands twisted nervously at his sides. But slowly the words slipped out, fragile yet true. Because I know what it feels like. To eat food that hurts you. To think you've been saved only to end up sick and broken. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Not even you. The honesty struck the billionaire harder than he expected. His chest tightened with something unfamiliar, shame. For years he had dined in excess, leaving plates half-eaten, wasting food without a thought while children like this boy scavenged from bins to survive. And now one of those very children had saved his life. Where are your parents? he asked after a pause, his voice softer than before. The boy looked down at the polished floor, his voice barely above a whisper. Gone long ago. The streets. They're all I know. His words carried no self-pity, only the tired acceptance of someone who had endured too much for his age. The billionaire's jaw tightened. For a moment, the grand hall with its chandeliers and silk-draped guests faded from his mind, replaced by the image of this child wandering alone through cold alleys, learning survival in ways no child ever should. Something in him shifted, an ache he could not quite name. The guests, still watching, leaned closer, sensing a strange turn. They had never seen their host like this, his pride softening, his voice trembling at the edges. Some frowned in discomfort, unable to accept that their powerful friend was speaking to a street child as if he mattered. Others, though, felt a stirring deep inside, a reflection of guilt they had long ignored. The billionaire drew a long breath. You have nothing, he said, not as an insult but as a statement of truth. No family, no home, not even shoes on your feet. The boy's eyes lifted, shining with quiet defiance. I may have nothing, he whispered, but tonight I gave something that mattered. The billionaire froze. The words rang in his mind like a bell, echoing through every guarded wall he had built over his lifetime. This boy who owned nothing, who had been ignored and mocked, had given more than wealth could buy: protection, honesty, and courage. For the first time in many years, the billionaire felt humbled. Truly humbled. He lowered his gaze for a moment, hiding the turmoil on his face. Then he looked back at the boy and asked, "What is it you want most? If I gave you one thing tonight, what would it be?" The boy hesitated. His lips trembled as if caught between hope and fear. He wanted to say food, a warm bed, perhaps even a chance to belong, but his voice failed him, and all he managed was, "I just don't want to be forgotten." The words pierced the billionaire's heart like a blade. Not money, not riches, not even comfort, just the desperate wish of a child who had spent his life invisible. The guests fell silent, some lowering their eyes in shame. They realized that in their glittering world of power and pride, they had forgotten countless others like him, and now one of those forgotten voices had saved them all. The billionaire's decision formed in that silence. He extended his hand, not the hand of a master to a servant, but the hand of one human to another. "You won't be forgotten," he said firmly. "Not anymore." The boy stared at the hand, unsure whether to trust it. His life had been filled with broken promises, with hands that offered cruelty instead of kindness. But something in the billionaire's eyes told him this moment was different. Slowly, hesitantly, he placed his small, rough hand into the man's strong grip. Gasps spread through the hall, but no one dared to speak against it. In that touch, the bond was sealed, not of wealth and poverty, but of gratitude and humanity. For the first time, the boy did not feel like a shadow in the corner. And for the first time, the billionaire felt the weight of connection to a life he had never understood. It was the beginning of an unlikely bond, one that neither the boy nor the man could ever have imagined when the night began. The grand hall was no longer the same place it had been when the evening began. The chandeliers still glowed, the silverware still gleamed, but the laughter, arrogance, and shallow pride of the guests had drained away. In its place lingered something unfamiliar: reflection, humility, and the silent recognition that they had witnessed a moment none of them could ever forget. The billionaire still held the boy's hand, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of another life in his own palm. It wasn't a deal sealed with signatures or contracts. It wasn't an alliance forged with wealth or power. It was something far rarer, gratitude tied with a thread of humanity. He released the boy's hand slowly, but the meaning remained. The bond was real and it was unbreakable. "Tonight everything has changed," the billionaire said, his voice echoing across the marble floor. "This boy whom you all mocked, whom you all wished to see thrown out, has done what none of us could. He saved me. He saved this house. And he did it without fear of what it might cost him." The boy lowered his head, uncomfortable under the sudden weight of attention. His cheeks burned. He had never been praised, never been honored, never been anything but invisible. Yet now he was the center of every eye in the room. The billionaire continued, his voice heavy with conviction. "I have lived my life believing that wealth was the measure of power. That influence came from the size of your empire or the weight of your name. But tonight I learned a lesson money could never buy. True power lies in courage. True wealth lies in humanity. The guests sat frozen. Some nodded slowly. Others shifted in shame, realizing how small they looked beside a boy they had dismissed as worthless. The billionaire turned back to the boy. From this night forward, you will not walk the streets again. You will not sleep hungry. You will not be forgotten. You will live here under my roof. You will eat at my table. You will have an education, a chance to be more than what the world tried to force upon you. The boy's breath caught. He blinked rapidly, unsure if he had heard correctly. For years, his life had been nothing but hunger and loneliness. And now, in a single night, the richest man in the city was offering him a future he had never dared to dream. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Why me?" The billionaire crouched slightly, lowering himself until his eyes met the boy's. His voice softened, almost fatherly, "Because you saw what others could not. Because you had the courage to speak when others stayed silent. And because you reminded me tonight that even I, perhaps especially I, have much to learn." The boy's tears fell silently, rolling down his dusty cheeks. He had not cried in years. Life on the streets had beaten the tears out of him. But tonight he couldn't hold them back. They were not tears of weakness, but of release. The kind that comes when a lifetime of pain finally meets a moment of hope. The guests rose slowly, unsure whether to applaud or to remain silent. Some clapped hesitantly, their jeweled hands making soft, awkward sounds. Others simply bowed their heads, knowing they had been humbled by both the boy and their host. The billionaire straightened and spoke one last time to the room. "Let this night be remembered, not as a celebration of wealth, but as the night a voice from the shadows saved us all." And with that, the evening ended. Not in laughter, not in music, but in a silence far more powerful. The boy was led away not by guards, but by servants instructed to treat him as a guest. For the first time in his life, he walked through golden halls without fear, without hunger, without invisibility. That night, he slept in a bed softer than anything he had ever known. His stomach full, his body safe. But more than food or shelter, he carried something deeper, a sense of belonging, a knowledge that his voice mattered. And the billionaire, alone in his study, sat with his thoughts. The memory of the boy's desperate shout, "Don't eat that," echoed in his mind. It was more than a warning. It was a lesson. A reminder that no matter how high a man rises, he can still be brought back to truth by the smallest, poorest voice. The boy's life was forever changed, but so was the billionaire's, for he had found in that child not just a savior, but a mirror, a reminder of humanity, a second chance at humility. And from that night onward, neither of them would ever be the same.